thank you very much to my students and all the people in the audience. We're very lucky and fortunate today to have Dr. Galen Jackson joining us. He is an associate professor of political science in the Leadership Studies Department at Williams College. And his research specialization is in diplomatic history, international politics, and specifically the Arab-Israeli conflict. So I have a copy of his book, which there's a few copies that we have on sale, A Lost Peace. So he's going to be presenting on his book, A Lost Peace, Great Power Politics and the Arab-Israeli Disputes, 1967 to 1979 with Cornell University Press. And this follows up on a bunch of different articles he's written in a variety of journals and other venues. And he's going to be talking about a lost peace, lost opportunities for peace from the past and the Cold War era in specific in the 1960s and 70s. So I think without further ado, I'll turn it over to Professor Jackson. So, okay, thank you.
Well, thanks for that very kind introduction, Josh. Debbie, thank you for meeting me earlier. And thanks to the Holly Bush Institute for sponsoring the talk, and to all of you for being here today, giving me the chance to talk a little bit with you about my research. So, go to the first slide. Before I get into kind of the substance of my talk, which will deal with the Cold War in the Middle East, I did want to briefly touch on some of the ways in policy terms that it is relevant today. So, for better or worse, great power politics is back with a vengeance at the moment. That is certainly the view for most high-ranking policymakers in Washington at the moment. I had to put Trump up here instead of Biden since he'll be taking office soon, but I would note, according to the Biden administration's official national security strategy, that was also its position. There's especially strong consensus in Washington on taking a hard line toward China. Major questions of the implications of China's rise, whether the United States and China can coexist peacefully, the future of Taiwan. These are all highly relevant questions at the moment. There's somewhat less consensus with regard to policy toward Russia, but obviously we have an ongoing war in Ukraine. And just in the last few days, in fact, Russian President Vladimir Putin has made quite a few new nuclear threats. So this is all very much front and center at the moment. I could list quite a few others. For now, I'll just say the questions of how do you handle relations with countries like Iran and North Korea and their respective nuclear programs are also relevant here. And the major question that always comes up in these debates is how exactly should the United States approach foreign policy with respect to these countries? Is conflict inevitable? Is it more or less impossible for Washington to do business with these countries because they are so wedded to their respective ideologies? I think with respect to that question, Iran is probably the best case in point in the existing policy debate. Or is it possible to work with them on a more business-like basis and cooperate where power political interests are overlapping? At a more general international relations level, this bears on a very important question that scholars are concerned with, which is there anything of a general nature that can be said about what kind of foreign policy makes for a more peaceful and stable international system and that accommodates everyone's core power political interests? So that's one set of questions I'm hoping I'll address today. Next one. Now, the last time I gave this talk was prior to October of last year. Unless you've been living under a rock, you know some things have transpired in the Middle East since then. And as deeply unfortunate and troubling as those events are, it does raise a whole host of relevant questions to my book today. You don't have to go back too far in history when the assumptions about the Middle East looked quite different. So if you think of the 2020 Abraham Accords, in which Israel normalized relations with a number of Arab states, particularly the United Arab Emirates. The thinking at the time was that the Middle East was moving toward sort of a more stable regional order, even though the Palestinian question had not been adequately addressed. I'm sure some of you are now famous with the infamous quote from Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. You can't make this stuff up. This was 9 days before October 7th when he wrote, "The Middle East is quieter than it has been in decades." That quote has not held up particularly well. Aside from the horrific October 7th Hamas attack and Israel's massive retaliation in Gaza, which by the latest estimates have left roughly 44,000 Palestinians dead, the vast majority of them civilians. We've also seen direct clashes between Israel and Hezbollah on Israel's northern front, direct Israeli-Iranian clashes for the first time, renewed attention on the question of whether Iran will race to acquire nuclear weapons, continuing violence in the West Bank, a consolidation of the hardline conservative movement within Israel, and a further discrediting of the Palestinian Authority, and particularly in the West Bank, a rise in popularity for Hamas among Palestinians. So as Trump prepares to take office, this has left us with the prospect of a serious escalation in the region, which remains highly volatile. And that's kind of the last thing that US policymakers want at the moment. I think if you polled most Americans, you would probably get very little support for another major military operation in the Middle East, especially when the priority for the last decade has supposedly been repositioning assets toward the Asia Pacific to deal with the rise of China. So this is all to say I think this project is important for what it says about how we got into this mess we are in today. My book ends with the picture in the upper left there, the famous picture of President Jimmy Carter, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin celebrating the signing of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty in March 1979. So I'm going to talk about how we got to that moment. But I'm hoping that my talk will shed some light on why we were not able to achieve more at that time, and particularly a comprehensive Arab-Israeli agreement that would have addressed the other dimensions of the dispute, and of course, above all, the Palestinian dimension. And I think that's an especially important question to be asking at the moment, given that for many analysts, the idea of a two-state solution, in other words, a solution that leads to a Palestinian state living in peace beside a Jewish state, has all but collapsed. I want to be careful to say that this is not the only set of issues that led to the mess we're in today. The Middle East is a really big place, and there's a variety of things going on, but the Arab-Israeli dispute is certainly a major part of the story, and I would argue one where the United States actually had a fair degree of agency when it came to shaping events. All right, so with that wind-up out of the way, again, I'm going to be talking about the Cold War in the Middle East, and I want to begin by talking a little bit about how many analysts tend to view the Cold War. I would argue that in the view of many historians and political scientists, the Cold War was more or less predictable, and perhaps more importantly, an entirely natural political outcome. That argument sort of comes in two different flavors. If you study international relations theory, one of these is the sort of hardline realist idea that the international system is anarchic, and therefore great powers are forced to compete with one another for security. And so it was sort of inevitable that the United States and the Soviet Union would clash. But the second strand is arguably more influential, at least in this country. And that argument is basically that the United States was doomed to failure when it came to trying to work with the Soviet Union because Moscow was so committed to its communist ideology that working with it on a sort of realpolitik basis and in a business-like manner was simply out of the question. As a revolutionary state, the Soviet Union simply was never going to accommodate to that sort of policy. So, for example, President Ronald Reagan, in his very first press conference, said that he knew, quote, of no leader of the Soviet Union since the revolution, and including the present leadership, that has not more than once repeated in the various communist congresses they hold their determination that their goal must be the promotion of world revolution and a one-world socialist or communist state. He went on to say that the only morality they recognize is what will further their cause, which meant that they reserved unto themselves the right to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat, in order to attain that. He famously also referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire. And I would argue that view is still quite prominent among major academics today. So Sergei Radchenko at Johns Hopkins just wrote a major book making essentially that argument. People like John Lewis Gaddis have made that argument. I'll just quote the historian Jonathan Haslam, who wrote that regardless of how reactionary in their preferences, the Soviet leaders were driven by the nature of the system to pursue the expansion of the revolution. Moscow had no intention of ending the Cold War through compromise. And I would add that that sort of view plays a quite key role in shaping certain US policies today. We can talk about whether Iran more fits the bill of that type of view in the Q&A maybe. But during Trump's first term in office, that was the administration's position toward Iran. His Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, was quite clear in comparing Iran to the Soviet Union and saying it was impossible to do business with Tehran for that reason. The next one. This sort of argument plays an especially important role when it comes to the whole story of the collapse of US-Soviet détente during the 1970s. And more importantly, in my view, a key role in discrediting the ideas that supposedly underpinned US policy toward the Soviet Union at that time. And that policy was supposedly underpinned by a set of realpolitik principles. Those of you who are students of American foreign policy undoubtedly know that the period during which Nixon and Ford were in power are sort of held up as the heyday of realpolitik foreign policy because of the influence of Henry Kissinger, who is considered realpolitik's sort of standard torchbearer in the modern era among American foreign policy practitioners. So what is meant in this case by a realpolitik policy? Well, at a basic level, trying to reduce international tensions with the Soviet Union by managing the conflictual elements of the relationship. In areas where American and Soviet interests were overlapping, trying to collaborate on those issues for mutual benefit. That was especially important in places that threatened to drag the two superpowers into a direct confrontation, one that could lead to World War III and which could conceivably escalate to the nuclear level. And above all, a willingness to put things like ideology to the side and work together on a power political basis. And again, for many observers, that approach was bound to fail, because the Soviets were never going to do away with their communist ideology. Reagan's ambassador to the United Nations, Jeane Kirkpatrick, said during an interview that détente had almost the opposite effect of what was intended. The Soviet Union was becoming more expansionist and more assertive and more violent in its pursuit of aggression and in its pursuit of expansion. Reagan himself, when he was running for the presidency, and I guess this is a timely quote, said that détente was what a farmer has with his turkey until Thanksgiving. So Gaddis, the eminent diplomatic historian, I think nicely summed this up when he said that for most people, the decision to seek détente in the early 1970s was an unwise exercise in wishful thinking, the effect of which was only to shift the signals in the eyes of Moscow's watchful and ambitious ideologues from red to yellow to green. And this explains why after Ford lost the election in 1976, Kissinger for the new right was considered the bête noire. And he spent a good period of his post-office life trying to convince his fellow conservatives that he actually had a very similar policy to them and that they only differed in tactics, which is a point that I'll come back to. So my argument in the book is that this whole story is wrong for essentially three reasons. It's wrong about Soviet policy, it's wrong about American policy, and it's wrong for what we should learn when it comes to the question of what makes for an effective foreign policy. And I use the Middle East as a sort of window to try to understand what drove the broader Cold War at a time when many people believed a lessening of tensions was possible. And my argument is that if the United States had actually pursued a policy that was in line with what it expressed at the rhetorical level, the outcome might have been fundamentally different. We might not only have had a genuine accommodation at the superpower level, but we might have actually had a comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace agreement. And given where we are in the Middle East today, I think that's a quite significant point. Okay, so for those of you that haven't studied the Arab-Israeli conflict in great depth, just some very quick background. In the June 1967 war, Israel in just 6 days succeeded in capturing the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. And in the ensuing negotiations at the United Nations, a very famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, resolution was passed, that being Resolution 242. I can talk more about the details of that resolution if people are curious, but in essence, that document basically said that the conflict would be settled on the basis of land for peace. In other words, Israel would withdraw from territories it captured during the war, and in exchange, the Arabs would accept a peaceful outcome to the conflict. The part of the resolution that was made deliberately unclear is how much land for how much peace. And you could argue that we have been arguing over that exact question for the last 57 years. It became clear very quickly that the parties to the conflict were not going to work this out on their own. And by the way, for people who sort of object to my argument and think that it must be left to the parties to decide, I guess I would ask, how's that going? If the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over and respecting a different outcome, I think you could argue that argument is the definition of insanity. So this raised the question of whether it was possible for the Cold War superpowers to work together to try to help get a peace settlement in the Middle East. After all, they were quite well positioned to do so. The Soviets, of course, had influence with the Arab states, especially Egypt and Syria, while the Americans enjoyed great influence with the Israelis. And throughout this period, you saw a great deal of discussion of what was referred to as an imposed peace. In other words, an agreement that the superpowers would largely work out in consultation with their clients, but that would more or less be forced on the parties to the dispute. And both superpowers had major reasons to want an agreement. I have the famous picture of Lyndon Johnson meeting with the Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban during the 1967 crisis, when the world thought for several weeks that a war in the Middle East could result in a Cold War superpower confrontation. This was fresh in everyone's mind. In addition, on the Soviet side, its Arab clients were, if anything, a major strategic liability. They vacuumed up huge numbers of economic and military resources at a time when we now know the Soviet Union very much could not afford it. And on the US side, likewise, there was a belief that US policy had to be balanced, that if you sort of aligned yourself too closely with Israel, that would leave the Arab world open to exploitation by the Soviet Union, and you would get a Cold War polarization of the region, which was considered all the more important because this was the moment when the Persian Gulf was becoming sort of the vital center of the world's energy system. I would add that US officials very much believed a peace agreement was in Israel's own interest. Those arguments you hear today are by no means new. They were made very, very frequently at the time. And on the US side, you constantly heard the Middle East compared to World War I and referred to as a powder keg. I would add as well that they were perfectly capable of cooperating elsewhere. If you've studied European diplomatic history, you know that the Americans and Soviets cooperated very closely on the question of what was known at the time as the German problem and on broader European security. Likewise, they collaborated on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to peer states. So it's not as if they hadn't done this before. But we know that an agreement is not what the outcome was. So that begs the question, why? So the first part of that question involves figuring out whether the two sides actually thought in power political terms, whether they were capable of thinking like that. And if they did, what other factors got in the way that thwarted a collaborative effort in the Middle East? And there's other explanations I could get into, but the three I'm going to talk about today are, was it a problem of Soviet policy? Did it have to do with domestic politics in the United States? Or was the problem more basic strategic calculations on the American side? Okay, so let's start with Soviet policy. All of the claims I made about the Soviet Union being too committed to its communist ideology and impossible to do business with sort of apply with special force in the Middle East. I think a good reason for that is that that was the narrative that Henry Kissinger went to great lengths to tell in his, I think it's something like 4,000 pages of memoirs. He was very attuned. I think it was Churchill that said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." He repeatedly says in those memoirs that the Soviet Union backed what he called the radical Arab program. And indeed, that view remains very common today. And essentially, the claim here is that the Soviets tried to exploit the Arab-Israeli conflict for Cold War purposes. That by exacerbating the conflict, preventing its settlement, that would force the Americans more into alignment with Israel and would cause the United States all sorts of problems in the Middle East. And I think that's reflected in these three pictures on the right, especially the bottom right one, which engages in all sorts of really awful stereotypes. But you can see a Soviet officer with a ruler of an Arab state from the Gulf sort of holding Europe and Japan hostage via the energy crisis. There is some truth to some of these claims, especially right after the 1967 war. The Soviets sort of were pulled in two directions at the time. On the one hand, they did see the Arab-Israeli conflict as a method that would make life kind of difficult for the United States in the Middle East at that time. And they therefore, to their great regret, did not separate themselves from their Arab clients when they were offered a very good deal in the immediate aftermath of that conflict. And I should say some of those discussions happened at the aforementioned Glassboro summit in the weeks immediately after the war. But on the other hand, they sort of knew that the Middle East was becoming a bottomless pit for them economically. They were deathly afraid of the conflict escalating, particularly since by 1967, Israel itself had acquired nuclear weapons. And so Soviet policy ultimately went through a transition. And I argue that by 1971, they were very much willing to make a deal with the Americans. And I'll get into the details of what they were offering in just a second, but that was even more pronounced after the October 1973 war again raised the prospect or the specter of a US-Soviet confrontation in the Middle East. So the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev, said immediately after that conflict that the Soviets, quote, had a right and duty to help get a settlement. When his foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, protested that that might upset the Arabs, he replied, "They can go to hell. We're not going to fight for them, and especially we will not start a world war because of them. So that's that. We will act like I said." And depending on what translation one uses, Brezhnev might have used much more, let's call it colorful language than that. Okay, so what exactly was the Soviet conception of peace? Well, the first thing, and I'm frankly puzzled that the claim still exists since the evidence is so overwhelming to the contrary, there's no evidence whatsoever that the Soviets were ever interested in the destruction of Israel. And they made that repeatedly clear in every meeting they had, both with their own clients in the Arab world and with the Americans. When it came to enforcing a settlement, they basically said whatever set of guarantees the United States and Israel were comfortable with. If Israel wanted the Soviet Union joining in that set of guarantees, that was fine with them. If they didn't want them joining, that was also fine. There was even talk of having a peacekeeping force via the United Nations, which could not be removed without a unanimous vote at the Security Council. And given that the US has a veto at the Security Council, that meant that you could not have a repeat of the 1967 crisis. They were perfectly willing to have this implemented in stages, as indeed the Egyptian-Israeli agreement ultimately was. This point was critical. At the time, the Soviets had somewhere on the order of 10 to 15,000 combat forces in Egypt, and they offered to withdraw those as part of a settlement. The only area where you could argue there might have been some daylight, or at least other scholars argue there might have been some daylight, is on the question of borders. And I can get into this in the Q&A, but by my reading, it's very clear the Americans understood that you could not have a comprehensive settlement in the Middle East except on the basis of the 1967 lines, with the exception of some minor rectifications. And actually, if people are interested, this is an area where there was an attempt made to actually suppress the evidence later on of what American policy really was. Next slide. Okay, so if the problem wasn't on the Soviet side, we have to look elsewhere. Some of you are undoubtedly aware of this book, which caused an absolute firestorm when it was published almost 20 years ago now. The Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt. The argument is essentially that the political influence of the Israel Lobby in the United States makes it impossible for the White House to pursue a forceful policy toward Israel. If that argument is right, there was obviously no way to do an imposed peace, which meant that there was no way for the Americans to pursue an imposed settlement in conjunction with the Soviet Union. I should say that the domestic level argument comes in other flavors as well. Some people believe there's just very broad public support for Israel in the United States for a variety of cultural and moral reasons. For now, I'll just say the Israel Lobby is certainly the most controversial domestic level argument and arguably the most influential as well. And the first thing I'll say here is one thing that was curious about that whole debate, despite it sparking such an enormous controversy, was that basically no one bothered to look at the primary source evidence. Mearsheimer and Walt, in fact, deliberately said that they didn't do that. And the main reason here appears to be methodological. There was an assumption made by a very large number of scholars that basically you would never find this sort of evidence in primary documents because no one wants to be charged with playing politics with national security policy. And so even if people are influenced by domestic politics, that sort of thing is not likely to find its way onto the written page. Fred Logevall, one of the major historians today working at Harvard, writes, "Policymakers are loath to actually admit, especially on the printed page, that they can be influenced by personal or partisan political interest in their foreign policy making. They wish at all costs to hide their selfish drives in the historical record." What was fascinating to me studying this stuff is that in the case of the Arab-Israeli conflict, those sorts of claims are demonstrably untrue. There are massive amounts of evidence. I'll read a few of the quotes highlighted here. This document on the left was written by Henry Kissinger in April 1975, considering whether to pursue a comprehensive settlement. He writes, "This approach would unleash the strongest negative reaction from Israel's supporters in the United States." Further down, "It would take a substantial effort to develop widespread public support for a position which would be vigorously opposed by some elements in the US. There is a strong case to be made that such an approach offers the best hope of survival, but a highly efficient lobby will be arguing the opposite." On the far side, this is a document written by Jimmy Carter's chief of staff, Hamilton Jordan, in June 1977. He writes, "It's even questionable whether a major shift in American public opinion on the issue of Israel would be sufficient to effectively counter the political clout of AIPAC," which is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. "If the American Jewish community openly opposed your approach and policy toward a Middle East settlement, you would lack the flexibility and credibility you will need to play a constructive role in bringing the Israelis and Arabs together." For the sake of time, I'll move on to the next one. If we want to go over these, this is a State Department paper making very similar points from 1974. Come back to it if people are interested later. Israeli Prime Minister, because of his status as a war hero, was kind of the perfect guy for the job. You couldn't accuse him of being soft on national security. So if Yigal Amir had not assassinated him in November 1995, we might have a peace agreement today. Again, I can't run the counterfactual, but I find that narrative actually pretty unconvincing. If you look at the opinion polls at the time, after the Oslo II agreement was signed, it was Rabin's lowest approval rating by far, right around 40%. The peace camp in Israel was very much on the defensive. I think it says a lot that within 6 months of his assassination, Benjamin Netanyahu, running on a hardline platform, won the election, even though he had personally been involved in inciting a lot of the awful things that led to Rabin's assassination. We can talk about 2000 if people want, but the sort of simplistic, it's all Arafat's narrative is, I would argue, quite inaccurate. And if you actually looked at what was accomplished during this period, it's pretty thin. Oslo I had a 5-year time frame to work out the final status issues. They don't even start talking about final status issues until a year after that timeline has expired. And perhaps above all, you had all sorts of veto players with a major incentive to undermine the process. Well, guess what? In the 70s, there's no Hamas, there's no Hezbollah. Until 1979, there's no revolutionary Iran, and it's contained pretty well during the 80s. The bloc of the faithful within Israel, or Gush Emunim, not nearly as potent a political force as it is today. I'd have to check the figures again, but I think if you include East Jerusalem, there's 750,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank today. That's not an issue in the 1970s. If we want to go sort of past the post-US 2003 debacle in Iraq, the region in the 70s, all the kind of frontline Arab states are ready to do it, with the possible exception of the PLO. And I would actually argue there's evidence to suggest they would have gone along with a deal. And we can talk more about that. But even if they weren't willing to, they were the weakest party involved and had no ability to stand against the whole of the Arab world, the United States, the Soviet Union, and really the entire world at the time. And the last point here is, and this is something else that was widely predicted by people like Jimmy Carter, by people like Zbigniew Brzezinski. By taking Egypt out of the conflict, you really reduced Israel's incentive to withdraw from the other territories because the Arabs no longer had a viable military option. As Israel's foreign minister at the time explicitly said, if you take one wheel off a car, it won't drive. If Egypt is out of the conflict, there won't be a war. And maybe predict isn't the best word here because whatever you think about Menachem Begin, he was very straightforward about what his goals were. He said he wanted to get Egypt out of the conflict so he could focus on building settlements in the West Bank. So for all of these reasons, I actually think the 70s was the moment to do it. And the fact that we didn't accounts in great part for the mess we find ourselves in today. And I guess this is a depressing note to end on, but if you're looking for solutions to how we get out of where we are today, you're asking the wrong guy. I think things are much likelier to get far worse than they are to get better anytime soon. So thanks. I'll take questions.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much to Professor Jackson for this really fascinating talk. In our class, in our Arab-Israeli conflict class, we really focused pretty tightly on Israel and Palestinians, Palestinian nationalism. So this added a lot to the Cold War context in a possible other way. Maybe there could have been a solution. So without further ado, I'll open it up to students, other guests. Any questions? I think Professor Charnak has the Zoom. There might be questions coming in from online. So we'll open the floor to questions for Professor Jackson.
What inspired you to write this book? What made you?
What inspired? That's a great question. To me, it was sort of the perfect combination of all the things I'm interested in. Great power politics, obviously, is at the heart of it. Sort of basic conceptual questions related to international relations theory. There are several wars that take place. I'm interested in what causes war and how you get out of those situations. And I guess to not be too complicated about it, I mean, 9/11 was my second day of high school. That's sort of, the generation I'm in, and in college, Iraq was exploding and a complete disaster. And yeah, the more I studied the region, the more I thought, again, I do think people take the argument too far. Hey, if we worked this out, everything would be peace. I don't believe that for a second. But I do think the Arab-Israeli conflict is linked in some pretty fundamental ways to what else is happening in the region. So it's sort of nicely brought together all of those interests.
Thank you. Student Sean, yes.
Hi. On one of the earlier slides, we were talking about how people, how many historians, actively either wrote off or didn't even explore any of the primary sources relating to
the Israel lobby stuff, yeah.
Why do you think they were so willing, or just completely ignorant to those, willing to write them off, or completely ignorant to the primary source information that was out there?
Yeah, I mean, I'd have a much kind of snappier answer for you if it weren't for Fred Logeval, who I quoted, who is a historian and who does study sort of the interaction between foreign policy and domestic politics. Most of the other people that made that claim were political scientists. So Mearsheimer and Walt, to their credit, they explicitly say it. Now, they're explicitly wrong, but they're at least transparent about their sources. Elizabeth Saunders, another political scientist, Jerome Slater, who you might have read in your class. In fact, I had him contribute a chapter to an edited volume, and sort of I invited him to use primary sources, and he said, no, thanks. So part of it might just be the different disciplinary methods and priorities, but I was surprised to see there are a number of historians who believe that. Now, this book is largely concerned with the post-Cold War phase, so in that sense, a lot of these documents weren't declassified, but when I showed some of these individuals these documents, they were quite surprised to see how much of it is written down. So I don't know if that answers your question. Maybe the answer is I don't know.
Great, thank you. Yes, Stephen in back.
Speaking of the primary source documents, is that where you found the lion's share of your information when doing your research and they overlooked them?
Yes, well, on that one in particular, but I mean, we were kind of talking beforehand. Depending where you go in the world, this stuff is not easy to do. I have all sorts of questions I would love to study, but archives in places like Egypt and Syria are not open. If you're studying U.S. foreign policy, and to a real extent Soviet foreign policy, given how much has come out, you don't really have a good excuse. There's just even online, Digital National Security Archive is great. You can find enormous amounts of documents online. But yeah, if you're kind of looking to find new stuff, there's no substitute for going to the archives. It can be frustrating and soul-crushing work, but when you find the goal that makes it all worth it.
Great, all right, thank you. Other questions? Yeah, in the back.
Where do you see this conflict taking off to with the incoming Trump administration and the way that, he talks about it, Senator Rubio, he's nominated for Secretary of State, talk about Israel and kind of just letting the chains off of Israel, so to speak. Like where where's this go? You said it could get worse. You said it's probably gonna get worse, but
Yeah. I'll give you kind of two different answers. One is, I mean, if you ever watch like Trump's rallies, even if you don't want to, they're kind of fascinating because it's just like stream of consciousness, like it's hard to know like what's going on up there. This is pure speculation, but one of my theories as to why he picked up votes among some Arab Americans is they sort of know what Harris would look like. Someone might like not cook his steak sufficiently and he'll be like, screw it, we're going after the Israelis. So, he's more unpredictable in that sense. So that's sort of my I don't know answer. I think the more likely outcome is we'll see more of the same from the first term, which is an extremely hard line on Iran. If you look at the nominations so far and the language that's being used, they're talking about resurrecting the maximum pressure campaign, so reimposing as many sanctions as possible. And I think there's a real possibility that he greenlights an Israeli annexation of the West Bank. Now, there's two things holding that back. One, on the American side, even if you think the Abraham Accords are sort of not in jeopardy if Israel does that, that would really make it hard to solidify this anti-Iran coalition that we've seen forming since about 2015. There's no way the Sunni Gulf Arabs are going to get on board with that sort of coalition if you have the Arab world in complete uproar over Israel annexing the West Bank. And the second reason is on the Israeli side, which is if they do that, what comes next? And I don't think anyone in Israel has an answer to that, even though there are some very high up ministers in the government that certainly want to do that. Look, I mean, this is, again, I'm not the guy to talk to if you want to feel good about this stuff. I think there's a possibility that if we see a larger regional escalation, I don't rule out the possibility of mass expulsions in that context, and I don't rule out annexation. But I certainly don't see any reason to think we're going to have any sort of meaningful peace negotiation anytime soon.
I want to follow up. I think there was one of the things I really enjoyed about your book was kind of reading about the U.S.-Israeli relations, some of the memorable presidential encounters with Israeli leaders. And, there's kind of this narrative of Israel being, a client or kind of being aligned with the U.S. I wonder if in your experience and what you wrote about in your book, did you find the U.S. had a lot of influence with Israel? Would it have been difficult for them to exercise influence with Israel?
I think there's no question that if they had really wanted to sort of drop the hammer,
Yeah.
Particularly at the time, the situation might be somewhat different today because, Israel has a very vibrant and stable economy. I mean, I still think there's all sorts of pressures that could be brought to bear, but the Israelis themselves say at the time, look, like, if the Americans really wanted to, they could completely isolate us and leave us no option but to go along. U.S.-Israeli relations is really interesting because on the one hand, there's kind of these very warm feelings of collegiality and people like Nixon, whatever he thought about policy, and the fact that he had some anti-Semitic inclinations, spoke very fondly of Israel, really admired them. Certainly that was the case with Johnson. And on the other hand, you get American leaders just absolutely outraged. So this is one Kissinger quote: "The Israelis better get me out of office. I'll tell you the next time I'll finish them. A great power cannot be treated this way." I'm sure you're all familiar with the famous Bill Clinton quote after he first met Netanyahu, which I'll paraphrase, not for the sake of the who's the effing superpower here? I think that's a very common attitude among U.S. officials. But your question in terms of whether the Americans had the leverage at the time, I think absolutely, if they exercised it.
That is interesting because I feel like even today we still have all the leverage in the world. Yet at the same time, I feel like a lot of Israeli leadership almost spits in the face of American leadership. For a big example would be about a month and a half ago, Biden said, oh, they have 1 month exactly to allow humanitarian aid in. The month has gone by and nothing. Recently, there have been reports of Biden behind the scenes getting really upset with Israel. And then when Bibi comes over, he bear hugs him on stage. I'm really confused as to how theoretically we do have all the leverage in the world against them. Yet we just kind of take that, and it's obviously hurting our international image, the ICJ, the South African case. Why?
Do you have the slides still? Yeah. It's the one that's some important evidence, this one. So if you want to take a look, a lot of this has to do with Congress. Great influence on Capitol Hill. I believe Congress has never blocked an arms sale to Israel ever. Look, you're getting at some very complicated questions. If I were to sort of spell out kind of the 4 explanations for the special relationship, come in kind of 4 buckets. One would just be broad public opinion, and that's kind of due to a variety of, support for the underdog, which Israel was believed to be for many years, moral considerations, the legacy of the Holocaust. I guess that's sort of part 2, moral considerations. 3 is the lobby argument, and 4 is Israel as a strategic asset. I think number 4 was always hard to substantiate. I think very few people believe it now. So you are left with kind of domestic level explanations for this. I think the whole thing about Biden and his personal feelings is sort of overrated just because you can't explain a constant with a shift. I actually don't think, regardless of who was president, the policy would have been all that different. Today I do think the domestic factor is pretty significant, but I'll tell you, trying to tease out the relative weight of those variables, AIPAC, public opinion, cultural affinity, it's almost impossible to do. I mean, I think I wasted a good portion of my 20s trying to do that. But I do think that's where the constraint lies. And a lot of that has to do with Congress. And again, this is, maybe we'll get something different with Trump because he doesn't have to stand for re-election. I think he's much more comfortable telling the establishment to take a hike. And I'm not optimistic about that by any means, but we'll see.
You talked about, we talked about how the 70s were the missed opportunity for peace and how how events unfolded during the 70s kind of in a way doomed the 90s. Do you also feel that the effects of the failure to act in the 70s have a profound effect on the U.S.'s use of their veto on the UN Security Council today and since the 90s repeatedly? Even the other week, we vetoed a resolution for an immediate ceasefire and the release of hostages. The resolution outlined called for a ceasefire as well as the release of hostages, and the U.S. vetoed it because they claimed it didn't want to release the hostages, which it was very clearly written that it did. Do you feel from what we explained with the domestic side of it and the U.S.'s saying one thing but acting in another way, how do you make sense of that?
First thing I'll say is, none of that's new. None of that's new by any means.
Yeah.
You look at votes, if it's on the Security Council, there's always these votes that are 14-1.
Yeah.
And if it's General Assembly votes, frequently, it's 185-3 because the U.S. can get the Federated States of Micronesia to vote with it in Israel at that forum. You'll hear very frequently that the key turning point is 1967. And I think that's sort of true, but for reasons that people get wrong. I think a lot of people don't know the foremost patron of Israel until 1967 was not the United States, it was France. France basically built Israel's nuclear program. It was its main arms supplier. France shifts policy very dramatically under de Gaulle. And the US sort of feels that Israel doesn't have anywhere else to go for arms or economic support or diplomatic support. I would also say that there is a genuine feeling among US officials in the 70s. I mean, this is obvious today, but at the time less so, that Israel gets unfairly singled out at places like the UN. So 1975 is the year of the Zionism is racism resolution. But yeah, I mean, it's basically almost a guarantee. I think the last time the US did anything at the Security Council was during the lame duck period in 2016, when Obama was headed out of office. And the US did not vote in favor of that resolution. It abstained, which is a de facto yes for the United States. But it was on settlements. And I think if you're talking about sort of this contradiction between stated US policy and actual US policy, the best example is settlements. I would say there's been one moment where the United States took a firm stand on settlements, and that was in 1991 with the first Bush administration, when it linked the loan guarantees Israel was seeking to settle Soviet Jews emigrating from the Soviet Union to Israel joining the Madrid Conference. Beyond that, the only other real case where the United States really puts a lot of pressure on Israel, you have to go back to Eisenhower.
Here's my Ryan, so Ryan Commissioner, thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask about a question about perceptions of the PLO and the story you're trying to tell, because so much of the story you're trying to tell is, and I appreciate it, and I share your conclusions, about the failure to make peace and the downward slope since then. But so much of the story you try to tell is a very powerful one that hinges on perceptions of the United States, perceptions of the Soviet Union, perceptions of the Arab leaders as being various shades of moderate to radical. And what we know about the PLO at this time is that there are groups within the PLO with genuinely radical political commitments. And this changed a lot of the discussion, I think, probably on either side of the US-Soviet divide. How does that play into your story? How the differences between the PLO and the Arab government make trouble for making peace later? And this is just a personal observation of mine, but do you sense any regret that we don't have a PLO of the 70s or 80s to deal with in the place of groups like Hamas or Hezbollah at this time?
Do you still have the slides? It is in some ways one of the most critical questions, so I'm really glad he asked it. And he's 100% right. There's no doubt that the PLO is a badly divided actor in the 70s between moderates and radicals. I think anyone that says otherwise is willfully blind to the evidence. I have the famous Arafat speech at the UN in November '74 here because it so perfectly encapsulates the division in one photo, although you can't see. Yeah, he's got an olive branch and a pistol. He actually brought a pistol to the floor of the United Nations and famously said, I hold a olive branch in one hand and a freedom fighter's pistol in the other. Don't let the olive branch fall from my hand. And so I think that very nicely encapsulates where the PLO was at. I would also stress, I am not of the belief, to use the Abba Eban quote, that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I think that's taking the argument too far. But there are some very real criticisms one can make of the PLO at the time. They refused to accept Resolution 242 or to recognize Israel's right to exist. Now, I would argue Israel also refused to recognize the PLO. It did support certain acts of terrorism in the 70s, and I think its support for the Zionism as racism resolution really hurt it when it came to trying to win the battle for public opinion within the United States. I think that did itself no favors. That all having been said, I think after the 1973 war, Arafat certainly and the moderates appeared ready to, although the term was not in use at the time, accept a two-state solution based on the West Bank and Gaza. Kissinger, who is frequently held up as, hey, I am Mr. not PLO, I refuse to work with them, they're a radical Soviet-backed actor. He said in November 1975, we could coexist with the PLO. It is indeed historically inevitable. 2 months later, he basically said if it weren't an election year, he said the optimum course was to go to the PLO. Any other year, I would do it. So even people like Henry Kissinger seemed to think there was room to work with them. On this point, I think the Palestinians had a valid case to make that if they're going to play that card, the Israelis should play that card as well. And ultimately, that's what ended up happening. It just took until 1993 for there to be mutual recognition. So I think that sort of goes both ways. And by the way, I would add here, the Soviets made that point repeatedly. Hey, the question of who recognizes who first is kind of a stupid question. That's what diplomacy is about. So why don't they recognize each other at the same time? And above all, like, what are they going to do? They're by far the weakest actor involved. They don't even have their own state. That CIA document I had up earlier, the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Jordanians, and the Saudis, in other words, all of the major frontline Arab states, plus their main financial patrons, all of them were pressuring them to accept a negotiated solution. And you add to that the combined weight of both superpowers, it's hard for me to see how they could have resisted that kind of pressure. But on the broader question, I concede the point that the Palestinians could have pursued a different policy. I think the best example of that is when they got Jimmy Carter, who I suppose we could have a debate about it, but I would regard as probably the most sympathetic US president to the Palestinian cause that has ever held office. He even tried to allow them to have reservations on Resolution 242, since that document does not actually use the word Palestinians in it and only refers to them as refugees. And they still said no. So I have some sympathy for the predicament they found themselves in. And if you talk to Palestinians today, they will say, hey, look at what happened in the 90s. Our skepticism was vindicated. We played our card, and we did not get our state back in return. But nevertheless, I think that policy was short-sighted given the opportunity that existed at the time.
I have a question. So I've lived all what we're talking about.
Okay.
Studied it too. But I have a question for you about this. Could it be that being in Lebanon and trying to create a Palestinian state within the Lebanese state in the 70s, after they were kicked out of Jordan, could that have really strengthened them? Because they felt that half of Lebanon was with them and the other half was against them. And they were strategically located. And to many, that was really the basis for their resistance of 242 and the resistance to take any peace, thinking that the Lebanese government, quote unquote, whatever it was, but the Sunnis at least, the Sunni Lebanese were going, and the Shiites eventually, were going to support the Palestinian cause and give them Lebanon until they found Israel, until they were actually destroying Israel. With that, nobody talks about this, but a lot of the Lebanese think that has really had a lot of impact on what we're living today, because also Lebanon today is really part of what's going on.
To say the least. That's an interesting theory. No, yeah, no. If it was a factor, I haven't seen it in the literature. Well, so there's Khalid El-Gindi. His book, I don't think mentions it. It's possible. I do not see it in any of their negotiations, either with the other Arab states or with the Soviets or the Americans. If I take what you're saying as they were sort of bent on ultimately dominating Lebanon and then using that as a kind of base to conduct the war against Israel, I haven't seen evidence of it. I will reiterate, there are plenty of radicals within the organization. And that I think is undeniable. And it's why Arafat steps so gingerly in these negotiations, because he knows he's dealing with serious constraints. The idea that they would take, the only reason I'm skeptical is because they were so unpopular in Lebanon. But well, by the time the Israelis invade in 1982, I mean, the Shia actually, until they sort of start supporting Hezbollah, they actually welcome the Israelis. Oh, great, we're going to get rid of the PLO. And in Beirut, huge resentment toward the PLO because destabilizing the country's politics and exacerbating the civil war. So I'm skeptical, but I haven't come across the theory.
Just a lot of Arab historians talk about this and
Okay.
say that it's not documented enough, the hatred, but the acceptance and the imposition of the PLO on Lebanon in 70, when was it?
1970, Black September, yeah.
That was really important. Just a question line.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Professor Jackson for the very great, useful Q&A session. If anybody has any further questions.